Good evening, Ambassador, our distinguished group of writers from the UK, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome on behalf of Bertelsmann AG and the British Council, who are co-hosting this event, this European Dickens Showcase. For those of you taking part in the seminar who were here this morning, you will have heard one or two of my initial remarks. I'm sorry for the repetition, but there are many other guests here this evening. It's been, as I said this morning, quite a week for British culture in Germany. We started the week with Gary Oldman and the film crew for the German premiere of Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, and the ambassador hosted a lovely event at his residence. The ambassador and I were then in Munich for 2 days opening a Stubbs exhibition, the very first time Stubbs' works have been brought together in Germany, in Munich. There's various other things going on this week. Of course, the highlight for us is this Dickens Showcase, although I almost forgot this morning, but not this evening. I have to mention Frederick the Great. We can't claim any credit for that, but it is obviously a very important event in Germany this week. So welcome to you all for this reading by David Nicholls, author of One Day, a bittersweet love story which has now been made into a film last year and was an astounding success in the UK and also in many countries overseas. Welcome, David. Welcome, Melanie Walz, our moderator for this evening, who will chair the discussion. We're delighted the ambassador is also able to join us this evening. Tonight's reading takes place as part of this Europe Dickens Showcase and the seminar entitled What Would Dickens Write Today? It's dedicated to Charles Dickens, a novelist, journalist, and social critic, one of the most celebrated British writers of all time, in celebration of his 200th birthday. Dickens, as we all know, has influenced film, theatre, music, and art, as well as writers of a wide range of genre and nationalities for over 200 years. And the themes we're discovering during this seminar are very relevant to a wide range of audiences today, and indeed to future generations. As far as the British Council is concerned, we're live streaming this whole event, and we've had hundreds of messages from people around the world from many, many countries who are listening and taking part as we go along. The British Council globally is celebrating the Dickens anniversary in well over 20 countries worldwide. This seminar is our Europe event, but things are happening in many other places. Before I hand over to Melanie and David, could I perhaps say a few introductory words to introduce to you Melanie Walz? Melanie was co-editor of the monthly Film Critic and editor of the Paul List Verlag in Munich. She's a professional translator, and her list of translations is really very impressive indeed. Peter Ackroyd, Dame Antonia Byatt, of course, Charles Dickens, just to name just a few. She has just published a new translation of Dickens's Great Expectations and A Christmas Carol. Melanie was awarded the Heinrich Maria Ledig-Rowohlt Übersetzungspreis in 2001 for the works of Dame Antonia Byatt. Just before we begin this evening, just a few points to mention how the evening is going to pan out. The reading would be in English. We're not offering any German translation this evening. After the reading, there'll be a question and answer session, and you're all warmly invited to take part. We've got microphones with people around the room. If you do want to make a contribution, please wait for the microphone. Otherwise, all those people out there listening to the live streaming wouldn't be able to hear you. And finally, outside in the foyer, you'll find a book table provided by Bücherstube Marga Schöller, where you can buy books from all of the authors who are present at this particular event. And indeed, if you ask nicely, the authors, I've been told, will agree to sign copies of the books for you. Please also join us for a glass of wine at the end of the reception to have a chat and a bit of networking. So thank you all very much for coming to this event. I hope you have a very enjoyable evening, and I'll now hand over to Melanie Walz.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be able to talk a little bit about and with David, and I think we can deem ourselves quite lucky to have David as subject matter, as someone who will be reading for us after the dinner break, because he will help you to get over that sleepiness or that bout of sleepiness that might come along, because he's such an excitingly funny and witty writer that you won't be sleepy any longer. I may just say some introductory words. David and Charles Dickens have some striking similarities. Both wanted to be an actor in their young days, and Dickens just became an amateur player, but you were an actor for some time.
Quite amateur, though.
Quite amateur, too, but you did it,
yes,
really.
I did, yes.
And that was subject matter for your second novel.
That's right.
And your first novel was called Starter for 10. It was published in 2003. And that was a novel about a young man who goes to university, who just lost his father, who doesn't know who he is, what he's about, and he wants to be cool and aloof. And that's, I think, something very Dickensian. That's the catchphrase. Yes. He wants to be cool and aloof. And, of course, everything he does is anything but cool and aloof, and he always realizes he is anything but cool and aloof, but he still tries to keep it up till the end of the book, when he finds some new mantra, which works much better. That is to be good and to be honest. I think that's very nice and very good. And there are two women in this book, of course. The beautiful one, which is not meant for him, and the other one he at first thinks isn't beautiful, but who is a witty and good girl. And I think it's a book that's very entertaining and very funny, but it has something very serious beneath this aspect. The second book, published in 2005, is called The Understudy, and that's hilariously funny at the start, because it's about an actor, a bad actor, who doesn't, well, perhaps he knows, but he doesn't want to realize that he's not a good actor, and he only gets to play horrible roles. He has to play the dead persons who are being wheeled away, and I think the book begins with a scene where the film director shouts, "Stop, stop, stop, we have to do it all over again," because the man has blinked his eyes again. And he's an understudy for an actor who I think is not a good actor either, but he's a famous one.
That's right.
And a bad character, of course, and a very shallow person. And, well, this actor who I'm talking about at least will find out that acting perhaps wasn't the thing he was meant to do, but he needs the advice of a woman he falls in love with to help him to gain some better knowledge of his identity. And, well, these are his first two books, and I think David might perhaps read now his chosen part of Charles Dickens. It was, I don't know, well, you'll tell us which book is it from.
Yes, it's Great Expectations again. I wanted to perhaps lower the cultural level a couple of notches and say that my first, and talk a little bit about musical theatre. My first taste of Dickens really came from the musical Oliver. I don't know how well known Oliver is in Germany. Is it well known? I didn't come from a very bookish household, but I watched a lot of television and a lot of films, and my parents, on their honeymoon, went to see Oliver, so we had the soundtrack album. It was one of the few records we had, and I used to listen obsessively to this soundtrack album and presumed that Charles Dickens had written You've Got to Pick a Pocket or Two. And my interest in Dickens was sort of provoked by this musical, and I read a children's edition of Oliver Twist, a shortened version, and I loved it, and that led me to Great Expectations, which remains from that moment my favorite novel, my all-time favorite novel by my favorite writer. I've never been so affected by a book before or since, and I had this illusion reading it that someone writing 120 years ago was writing about me, about exactly how I felt at that particular time in my early to mid-teens, 13, 14 years old, and not in a flattering way at all. Pip is a very ambiguous character. He's pompous and selfish and self-absorbed and endlessly going on about his unrequited love. He has this masochistic attitude to love, and he has vague aspirations. To quote another book, Howard's End by Ian Forster, he has vague aspirations and a familiarity with the outside of books, and that sort of summed me up completely at that age. And I found the book incredibly moving, incredibly touching, very, very funny. And as I say, I've never really been as affected by a book quite so much. I then went on to read all of Dickens over the years and to study him at university and always to be a passionate Dickens fan. And after 30 years after reading the book, I was asked, reading Great Expectations for the first time, I was asked to write a feature film screenplay of the book. And there are endless dangers involved with that. I hesitated for a very long time. I initially said that I wouldn't do it for well, any number of reasons. But as Claire Tomlin says in her book, it is an almost perfect masterpiece. And even the finest film adaptation is always going to be, at best, a distillation and at worst, a travesty of the original. In the case of Great Expectations, it's doubly difficult because David Lean's 1947 film of Great Expectations is widely considered to be the high point of British filmmaking. So the potential to upset people is immense. But I went back to the book and read it again and found all sorts of wonderful new things in it and took on the job. And we shot it last autumn, and I'm going to see the first cut on Monday. And it is, I hope, a faithful version, not a... There's no way of cramming 500 pages of closely packed prose into 2¼ hours of film, but I hope we've brought out elements of the book in a successful way. Helena Bonham Carter is playing Miss Havisham, and she's terrific. I think a part she was born to play, as they say. And Ralph Fiennes is playing Magwitch, and two terrific young actors are playing Pip and Estella as very young characters, as they should be. I love the David Lean film, but I always think that John Mills's Pip is about 38 years old. I never quite believe that he's 19 as he is in the novel. So anyway, who knows how that'll turn out? But I think one of the things I did want to draw out in this film version was that Great Expectations to me is a book about parenthood that has no parents in it. Pip is an orphan, and yet he's desperately in need of a father figure. He has two father figures in the book, Joe Gargery, who loves him dearly and would do anything for Pip, and yet is rejected by Pip as being too simple, too passive, too unambitious, too slow. For me, one of the many heartbreaking scenes in the book is when Pip patronizes and then snubs Joe on a visit to London, a scene that affects me every time. And then Magwitch, a man who desperately wants Pip to be like a son to him, and yet when he uses those words to Pip, Pip is horrified, disgusted that this man who may be a murderer wants to be his father. Estella has a theme with Miss Havisham, who wants to be a mother to her, yet twists and damages her in exceptionally cruel ways. So it's a book about parenthood without parents, and that's something I hope we've drawn on in our adaptation. One of the facts of adaptation is, however respectful one is to dialogue, to characterization, to story, the greatest travesty you always make with a film is the loss of the narrative voice, the loss of the novelist. And the most important character in Great Expectations is the older Pip, is Pip, the Pip who is telling us the story. Pip, the middle-aged man who is allowed to look back at his life with wisdom and distance and a wry humor and sympathy and understanding. And of course, when you put actions and events on the screen, you lose that voice. All you have with the screenplay is what people say and what they do. You don't have what people think. That becomes the property of the of the actors. That's not to say it can't be there, but it's very hard to put it in a screenplay without smothering the script with voiceover. So I thought today that it would be appropriate, therefore, to read something that isn't in the film and could never be in the film except thematically. The first line of the passage I'm about to read is, to me, one of the most important lines in the book, and yet it's a line that we couldn't give to a character to say, because no one in the film could be this wise, this knowing. So, this is from chapter 14 of Great Expectations. It is a most miserable thing to feel ashamed of home. There may be black ingratitude in the thing, and the punishment may be retributive and well-deserved, but that it is a miserable thing I can testify. Home had never been a very pleasant place to me because of my sister's temper, but Joe had sanctified it, and I had believed in it. I had believed in the best parlour as a most elegant saloon. I had believed in the front door as a mysterious portal of the temple of state, whose opening was attended with a sacrifice of roast fowls. I had believed in the kitchen as a chaste, though not magnificent apartment. I had believed in the forge as the glowing road to manhood and independence. Within a single year, all this was changed. Now it was all coarse and common, and I would not have had Miss Havisham and Estella see it on any account. How much of my ungracious condition of mind may have been my own fault, how much Miss Havisham's, how much my sister's is now of no moment to me or to anyone. The change was made in me. The thing was done. Well or ill done, excusably or inexcusably, it was done. Once it had seemed to me that when I should at last roll up my shirt sleeves and go into the forge, Joe's prentice, I should be distinguished and happy. Now the reality was in my hold. I only felt that I was dusty with the dust of small coal, and that I had a weight upon my daily remembrance to which the anvil was a feather. There have been occasions in my later life, I suppose as in most lives, when I have felt for a time as if a thick curtain had fallen on all its interests and romance, to shut me out from anything save dull endurance any more. Never has that curtain dropped so heavy and blank as when my way in life lay stretched out straight before me through the newly entered road of apprenticeship to Joe. I remember that at a later period of my time, I used to stand about the churchyard on Sunday evenings when night was falling, comparing my own perspective with the windy marsh view, and making out some likeness between them by thinking how flat and low both were, and how on both there came an unknown way, a dark mist, and then the sea. I was quite as dejected on the first working day of my apprenticeship as in that after-time, but I'm glad to know that I never breathed a murmur to Joe while my indentures lasted. It is about the only thing I am glad to know of myself in that connection. For, though it includes what I proceed to add, all the merit of what I proceed to add was Joe's. It was not because I was faithful, but because Joe was faithful, that I never ran away and went for a soldier or a sailor. It was not because I had a strong sense of the virtue of industry, but because Joe had a strong sense of the virtue of industry, that I worked with tolerable zeal against the grain. It is not possible to know how far the influence of any amiable, honest-hearted, duty-doing man flies out into the world, but it is very possible to know how it has touched oneself in going by, and I know right well that any good that intermixed itself with my apprenticeship came of plain, contented Joe, and not of restlessly aspiring, discontented me. What I wanted, who can say? How can I say, when I never knew? What I dreaded was that, in some unlucky hour, I, being at my grimiest and commonest, should lift up my eyes and see Estella looking in at one of the wooden windows of the forge. I was haunted by the fear that she would, sooner or later, find me out, with a black face and hands, doing the coarsest part of my work, and would exult over me and despise me. Often after dark, when I was pulling the bellows for Joe, and we were singing Old Clem, and when the thought of how we used to sing it at Miss Havisham's would seem to show me Estella's face in the fire, with her pretty hair fluttering in the wind, and her eyes scorning me, often at such a time I would look towards those panels of black night in the wall, which the wooden windows then were, and would fancy that I saw her just drawing her face away, and would believe that she had come at last. After that, when we went into supper, the place and the meal would have a more homely look than ever, and I would feel more ashamed of home than ever in my own ungracious breast. Thank you.
I think it's astonishing how having a how hearing a text being read changes your way of thinking about that special part of the book. And I think it's for the first time now that I realize that what you've been reading now about Pip being so ashamed of his home due to his new connections, of course, may be a reflex of the way Dickens felt ashamed for his time in the shoe-blacking factory.
Yes.
And Joe is, of course, not his father or anyone else, but Joe is his inner conscience.
Yes.
His ambition to become someone better, and the images of Estella and Miss Havisham are just images.
Yes, yes. Yes, I think
Is that one of the reasons why you chose it?
I think I chose it because I was interested in this, in the notion of what we lose when we adapt, the idea that we lose this wonderful stuff that you can't just put into someone's voice, into dialogue. I was also interested because I've loved all the conversations we had today, but we've sort of keep glancingly touching on the issue of class, and to me Dickens is the supreme writer of class, and his own insecurities and his own shame at aspects of his own background are there throughout all the works and on nearly every page. And I think he writes brilliantly in this book about, as he says there, meaningless aspirations that Pip wants to be, has this thing he keeps saying he wants to be a gentleman, and yet that's never defined. It's not that he wants to be a doctor or an engineer, he just wants to be this thing called a gentleman. I think often I'm told this particularly at schools, teachers today are always shocked how many children say they want to be famous without knowing what they mean by that. They just want to be famous for something. It doesn't matter what, but it's the fame that's important. And for Pip, it's this notion of being a gentleman, a completely meaningless term. He has a line where he says to Jaggers, "But what am I to do? What will be my trade?" And Jaggers says,
"There will be no trade. There's no trade intended for you. You'll be just a gentleman." And
he has such an Dickens. I mean, we've all also, as novelists, all been remarking in a rather insecure, shamefaced way on Dickens' extraordinary work ethic, and that is shamefully what Pip lacks. He has this terrific opportunity of money and freedom and books on the walls of his room, and he doesn't take advantage of it. He does nothing good with that opportunity.
The only thing he does is some reading.
Yes.
That's what he's proud of, but
yes.
That's not much.
No, and he helps Herbert out towards the end, just before the money disappears. But.
And that perhaps may be a very critical view of Dickens on the gentleman as such.
Yes.
Perhaps even unconsciously done.
Yeah,
as a parasitic sort of...
yes. I mean, I think Claire writes really brilliantly about this in her biography, his social insecurity, the fact that he was an autodidact and would never have had the opportunity of attending a university, and even when meeting all these aristocrats and society figures, there's always a sense of his insecurity, his sense of feeling out of place, his fear that it might all be taken away from him, that it all might disappear. I think that comes across in his personality as well.
Perhaps that's something we haven't been talking so broadly about, that his social insecurity makes him such a modern writer. We've been guessing now why might Dickens be a writer people still can read today. Perhaps it has to do with this fact.
Yes, yes.
You just pointed out.
Yes. In my first novel, I think it's very un-Dickensian, except in this theme. The central character in my first book hopes to find his escape through education, through the university system, and I was interested in the relationship between class and education. How, when I was at school, it was considered to be interested in science or literature or anything really was considered to be posh, and that always confused me. It seemed strange to me that there's this link between intelligence and class. It seemed a very reactionary notion for working class kids to propagate, that you were getting ideas above yourself if you were getting above yourself if you took an interest in studying. And I certainly felt that, and that again is a theme that you see throughout great expectations. So I think that was, in my first book, that was something that I definitely drew on. It's not nearly as, I mean, it's a very frivolous, light-hearted book. It's a comic novel, but...
well, it's comic, but it does have some deeper meaning as well, as the second
yes.
one, too.
Yes.
I was astonished in your first book, and it was quite striking that when Brian Jackson, the hero, comes to see his beloved Alice Harbison,
yes,
from a very posh family, and he is really shocked to see how filthy their household
yes.
really is.
No, he has. They have the. I mean, so much. It's interesting. We were talking about how writers disguise the autobiography, and I spend a lot of time denying autobiographical elements in that book. But that absolutely comes from a visit I made when I went to university, and I was invited to stay with a family who I was incredibly intimidated by. They seemed very learned and upper middle class and intellectual and bohemian, and I was horrified by their fridge. You know, they had this aristocratic confidence to live in squalor because it was aristocratic squalor. It was the kind of muddy boots and the rotting pheasant carcasses in the fridge, and that struck me as strange. My mum would never let the fridge get like that. So that's one of the details that was absolutely drawn from life. And we were talking about, you know, disguising ourselves in books,
yeah.
and when there was a lot of autobiography in that first book, and when I was very nervous about my family, and particularly my parents, reading it, because when I got into university, when I started university, I was pretty obnoxious about it. I loved university. I really embraced that world, and I definitely came back with, you know, airs and graces, and it's very sniffy about them putting red wine in the fridge, and, you know, kind of all sorts of very Pip-like obnoxiousness, really, no other word for it. And when I came to write the book and I look back at that period of my life, I was very ashamed of those moments of snootiness, of, you know, constantly, you know, buying my parents volumes of T.S. Eliot for Christmas, and really awful behavior, and very, very Pip-like.
But after out-pipping Pip, you became a better man yourself as well.
I mean, I hope so. But when I was writing the book, I wrote the book partly as a sort of apology to my parents for that period of my life, but I didn't want it to know that it was about, you know, to them or about them. So I methodically removed anything. I have a brother and a sister, so I made sure that the character was an only child, and I grew up in a town called Eastleigh, and so I made Brian grew up in a town called Southend, and I worked quite hard to disguise things that were autobiographical, primarily by the Brian Jackson's father is dead.
He's a half orphan as well, like Pip at the beginning of the book.
That's right, yes. So he has his mum, who he treats very badly, much as Pip treats Joe, but he doesn't have a father. And when the book came out in proof edition, I took a deep breath and I sent it to my parents, and I said, all the things you usually say, that it's a work of fiction, that there's nothing in there to be afraid of, that all the drinking and the sex didn't really happen, and that it has nothing to do with, and they shouldn't be upset, and some time went by, and nothing happened, and no one remarked on it, and finally I was having one of the very monosyllabic conversations I have with my father, and I said, so did you read the book? And he said, yes, I did, and you didn't have to kill me. And I realized that, you know, it doesn't matter. Well, one can always say it's only fiction. It doesn't matter how hard you try to cover that stuff up, that, you know, that it will always bubble up, even if you work very hard to keep it down. And I feel that a lot in, when I'm asked about books, one of the common questions is, understandably, is, you know, how much of it is true, how much of it is autobiographical, and sometimes I say nothing is autobiographical, and sometimes I say actually quite a lot is autobiographical. And I'd love to ask Dickens those questions.
Perhaps both is true, you know.
Yes, yes.
It's all true and it's all fiction. Of course, Uncle Des, or as we later have to call him Des, isn't Biddy, I know.
Yes, yes. There's definitely, and also, you know, Alice in the first book is very much an Estella figure, and that you know that she's never really going to...
Was there something realistic in the background for Rebecca Epstein?
I think there's a sort of Rebecca figure in all the three books I've written, and that's a character that you don't really find in Dickens. The kind of smart,
self-reliant woman.
Self-reliant, wittier, smarter, more self-aware than the male character. It's the sort of Beatrice in Much Ado tradition, or Katharine Hepburn in any of those Hollywood comedies. You know, the fast talker, the back chatter, the person with a political and social conscience who is wiser than the protagonist, a better person than the protagonist, and who rescues the male protagonist.
I think your former work as a playwright for TV and film made you especially sensitive for writing wonderful situations.
Well, I always feel I started as a screenwriter. I started as an actor, and my acting career was a terrible waste of time and an awful pain to inflict on audiences. And I wasn't very good at it. And it took me a long time to come to the realization that what I loved about acting was writing. That what I loved about performance was the kind of fizz and the rhythms and the snappiness of a really well-written dialogue scene, and I loved the investigation of character, and I loved interpretation. I loved seeing a great actor bring a role to life, and all of those things I couldn't do as a performer. But I'm very grateful for the hours I spent listening and watching really, really good actors. And when I started to write, it seemed natural to start with scripts. I was pretty much bullied by my friends into writing scripts because they didn't want to see me in any more plays. And so I co-wrote a script with a very good friend of mine, a theatre director called Melanie Walz, and he pretty much tied me to the desk and made me do it. And I gradually realized that I could story tell on the page much better than I could on the stage. So I came to writing very late. I didn't become a full-time writer until slightly more than 10 years ago. And I'm grateful for that time as an actor, and I understand Dickens' affection and I think slight envy of performance. I would never do what Dickens did and do those one-man shows because it wouldn't be fair. But I do have that affection and slight envy for it. Writing fiction to me felt a little bit impertinent. It felt completely unattainable. I wrote a television series. I wrote on a TV show called Cold Feet, which was a great success, but it wasn't my show. I was just a gun for hire on it, and so I was piggybacking on someone else's imagination. And then I was given my own show, which was a terrible flop, and so I went into a bit of a spin and a bit of a panic, and I took some time off, and I wanted to find a subject that I was passionate about, and my time at university came up and as a possible subject, and it just came out as I started writing a monologue, what I thought would be a dramatic monologue, and after a while I realized that it was a novel, a first-person novel. So I didn't really sit down and think, right, I'm going to write fiction. I sort of stumbled upon it. I'm very glad I did, but I've always felt slightly insecure as a novelist in writing in the third person. To me, writing a first-person novel feels like improvisation. It feels like finding a character, an attitude to life, a state of mind. I don't want to make it sound mystical, but I found writing in the first person very free and very improvisational. Whereas writing in the third person, there's always the pressure, quite understandably, to write good prose because there's no character to hide behind and there's no excuse.
You have to be the all-knowing writer.
Yes, yes.
Whereas the first person is a persona you can hide behind.
Absolutely.
Can be a mask.
And if your thoughts and your ideas and your descriptions are banal, then it's not you, it's Brian Jackson. Yeah.
Stupid Brian.
Yes. And of course, when Dickens writes in the first person, he writes brilliantly, beautifully. He writes like Dickens. And yet he's also specific. I mean, the first-person voice of David Copperfield is very different from the first-person voice of Pip. It's very different from the third first-person voice in Dickens, which is Esther Summerson in Bleak House.
She's a very deranged person.
Yes, yes. Well, Bleak House is my second favourite novel. I think that's a remarkable novel. And when I was at university, Esther always got a very hard time as being the archetypal, wimpy, sort of bland, goody-goody Dickens heroine. But I think there's another reading of that novel that's much more sophisticated.
Highly hysterical, neurotic, and
yes,
interesting
passive-aggressive,
person.
and that actually she's
very strange.
It is strange. It is strange. It's disconcerting.
It's interesting.
But very, very interesting, I think.
She's not a sweet person.
No, not at all.
I think, if I may say so, that Started 410 and the second book, The Undercover, together, The Understudy, are both your versions of Great Expectations. Different ones, but you could take them as two different Great Expectations written by you.
They always, references to it always find their way into the book. I was reminded, I haven't looked at Started for 10 for ages, but the...
In Started for 10 we have,
it's the line from this first scene with Estella. He calls the knaves jacks, this boy.
Yes.
Which is his first social humiliation, his first awareness that he is this thing, he's common and coarse. He doesn't realize until this point.
He won't get Alice.
Yes. And that is...
and Bleak House is the Christmas present.
Oh,
by his mum.
Yes. So there are lots of little quotes.
Yes, and there's a question in the University Challenge quiz. What's the real name of the person called Pip in Great Expectations?
So
I hope you know it.
I mean, the other, because it's a coming-of-age novel, I also drew on all those great coming-of-age novels, Lucky Jim. I don't know, again, how well-known it is here, but Billy Liar, which is a wonderful novel and film about a fantasist, about someone who's aspirational without knowing what they're aspiring to. Howard's End, the character of Leonard Bast in E.M. Forster's Howard's End, but very much Catcher in the Rye, Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, which any coming-of-age novel now has to draw upon Catcher in the Rye, has to acknowledge Catcher in the Rye. And, of course, the first line of Catcher in the Rye is, and I'm going to paraphrase it horribly, but I suppose I should begin with all, where I'm from and when I was born and all that David Copperfield bullshit. So he starts by attacking that Dickens tradition, but David Copperfield, Great Expectations, Catcher in the Rye, they're all great coming-of-age stories. It's a fascinating subject, I think. That period, that awkward, romantic, desperate, humiliating period between childhood and adulthood, and my regret is that both of those books that I wrote them when I was learning how to write, and I don't want to stop anyone buying them, but they're not particularly wonderful. I'm fond of them rather than proud of them, and I wish that we could. I wish we could remake novels in the way that films are remade, because I'd love to.
Oh, David, no problem. There are writers who do that.
Well, I know.
Second writer, no, name is lost. It will come back later. At the end of his life, he began to rewrite all his novels. If his editor would be here, she could help me out, but she seems not to have come. Well, he will come later. But these two novels, you published them in 2003 and 2005, so you wrote them in a very short time.
Yes.
And then you took some more time, much more time, for your third book, and I think your third book is very, very different from the first two ones.
Yes.
It's much more serious, it's much more elaborate. I think when you have the story of a couple who meets accidentally, they're not quite sure whether they are falling in love or not, or it's just one night stand. And then you take this day each year, but you're not telling what happens on this day each year, but you're doing something much more complicated and much more artistic.
Yes, it's 20 days. It's the 15th of July on 20 years between 1988 and 2007, and it's a love story told in snapshots, if you like, Polaroids of moments in time, and you don't find out the significance of this date until the end of the book. And again, I found myself stealing from Great Expectations, twice quoting Great Expectations. But this, to me, while I was writing that book, I was rereading Great Expectations to decide whether or not to write the script. And I came upon this passage in Great Expectations, which is just after Pip has been to see Miss Havisham for the first time. That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me. But it is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a long moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers that would never have bound you, but the formation of the first link on that memorable day. And I was incredibly taken aback by that passage because it completely summed up the governing idea of this novel, One Day, that there's no such thing as an ordinary day, that each day is a link in the chain, and one day takes one of these links and examines it. And there's another passage quoted, the male character leaves university and goes to London in the great melee and decadence of London in the mid-90s. I'm told. I didn't experience any of it, but I was vaguely aware of it in Sunday newspaper supplements, that this was quite a wild time to be in London. I rarely left the house, but apparently people were having a good time. Again, reading Great Expectations, I found a passage that completely summed up this very decadent, foolish, self-absorbed, fatuous lifestyle that Dexter, the male character, experiences in his late 20s. We spent as much money as we could and got as little for it as people could make up their minds to give us. We were always more or less miserable, and most of our acquaintances were in the same condition. There was a gay fiction amongst us that we were constantly enjoying ourselves, and a skeleton truth that we never did. To the best of my belief, our case was in the last aspect a rather common one. And it is a rather common one. It's exactly what that period of time felt like to me, this constant pressure to have a good time, and if not, to pretend you're having a good time.
At least to pretend.
Yeah, which is exactly Pip's state and the character Dexter's state at that period of his life.
Perhaps I think it would be nice if you just read a passage of your new novel.
Yes, this is... This again is this isn't particularly a favourite passage from the book, or a particularly helpful passage if you don't know the novel. But I wanted to write something that illustrated this problem of the narrative voice, the attitude of the narrator. I once got in trouble for saying that writing there was something unnatural about writing comic novels in the third person. And inevitably people came back with lots of examples of why that wasn't true. But I think it's probably the fashion, certainly in a lot of 20th century novels, to be a rather distant, objective narrator, a third-person voice, to have a certain distance and certain coolness. And writing comedy in the third person means that there's this person, the novelist, telling you jokes. And it's a strange thing for a novelist to do, or it seems to me sometimes a strange thing for a novelist to do. When I've tried to write in the third person, I turn into this kind of stand-up comedian, constantly cracking jokes, and it's sort of crass, really. I think it comes across as too eager to please and insecure. There's a line, one of the characters in the novel says that if he wasn't being funny, he didn't know what he was being. And I felt a bit like that as a novelist trying to write in the third person, that it had to read like comic writing all the time. And writing this book, I think, was my attempt to try and calm down a little bit and not be like an overexcited guest at a dinner party, always trying to tell gags. And yet, I didn't want to write in a very chilly, plain, flat third-person voice either. So I suppose this passage I'm going to read is somewhere in between. It was an attempt to take on some of the qualities of novelists I love, like Dickens, of course, but Muriel Spark, who have a very wry tone, a very satirical, observational tone. This is a chapter called The Third Wave, which is set on the 15th of July, 1999, and Dexter and Emma are going to a wedding. They have started to arrive. An endless cascade of luxuriously quilted envelopes thumping onto the doormat, the wedding invitations. This wasn't the first wave of weddings. Some of their contemporaries had even got married at university, but in that self-consciously wacky, rag week way, a let's pretend parody of a wedding, like the jokey student dinner parties where everyone wore evening dress to eat tuna pasta bake. Student wedding receptions were picnics in the local park, the guests in Oxfam suits and second-hand ball gowns, then onto the pub. In the wedding photos, the bride and groom might be seen raising pint glasses to the camera, a fag dangling from the bride's rouged mouth, and wedding gifts were modest. A really cool compilation tape, a clip-framed photo montage, a box of candles. Getting married at university was an amusing stunt, an act of benign rebellion, like a tiny tattoo that no one ever sees, or shaving your head for charity. The second wave, the mid-20s weddings, still retained a little of that tongue-in-cheek, homemade quality. The receptions took place in community centres and parents' gardens. Vows were self-composed and rigorously secular, and someone always seemed to read that poem about the rain having such small hands. But a cold, hard edge of professionalism had started to creep in. The idea of the wedding list had begun to rear its head. At some point in the future, a fourth wave is expected, the second marriages. Bittersweet, faintly apologetic affairs that are over by 9:30 on account of all the kids. It's not a big deal, they will say, just an excuse for a party. But for the moment, this year is the year of the third wave. And it is the third wave that is proving the most powerful, the most spectacular, the most devastating. These are the weddings of people in their early to mid-30s, and no one is early to mid-30s, and no one is laughing anymore. The third wave is unstoppable. Every week seems to bring another luxuriantly creamy envelope, the thickness of a letter bomb containing a complex invitation, a triumph of paper engineering, and a comprehensive dossier of phone numbers, email addresses, websites, how to get there, what to wear, where to buy the gifts. Country house hotels are being block booked. Great schools of salmon are being poached. Vast marquees are appearing overnight like Bedouin tent cities. Silky grey morning suits and top hats are being hired and worn with an absolutely straight face, and the times are heady and golden for florists and caterers, string quartets and ceilidh callers, ice sculptors and the makers of disposable cameras. Decent Motown cover bands are limp with exhaustion. Churches are back in fashion, and these days the happy couple are travelling the short distance from the place of worship to the reception on open-topped London buses, in hot air balloons, on the backs of matching white stallions, in microlight planes. A wedding requires immense reserves of love and commitment and time off work, not least from the guests. Confetti costs £8 a box. A bag of rice from the corner shop just won't cut it anymore. Thank you.
I think that passage is quite a good choice because it's quite typical for this new book. On the one hand, it's very, very funny and very well done. On the other hand, it's very, very sad.
Right, yes.
Is that what real fun ought to be like?
Well, I wanted to write something that was... one of the things I loved about Dickens, I've always taken from Dickens, is I don't want to sound a pushover, but I really get upset reading Dickens. I mean, I find, the death of Joe, the crossing sweeper in Bleak House, or Pip's final scene with Magwitch in this book, or the scene in which Joe Gargery comes to London and Pip humiliates him. Those scenes always set me off, and I loved that in Dickens, and I love that within 10 pages you can be laughing out loud, and I think that often when one writes this these days, when you say I'm working on a book, people say, well, what is it? Is it a romantic comedy? Is it a drama? There's a need to apply quite precise genres to the kind of fiction one writes, and I like the idea of doing something that was both funny and sad. The first two books were quite conventional comedies, romantic comedies, not necessarily particularly romantic, but certainly comedies. And this one I wanted to write something that was a little less clearly defined. And I love that about Dickens. I think he's a great writer of... When people talk about Dickensian, it can mean so many things. It can mean sentiment, it can mean those great, extraordinary, broad characterizations, it can mean a kind of gothic darkness, it can mean any number of things. And I wanted to write something that was tragicomic.
I think the first books were very funny and at the same time serious beneath the fun. And the third book is completely different because it's funny and sad at the same time.
Yes.
The seriousness has turned into sadness. And also it covers a much more longer period. It's just not coming of age and getting to know who perhaps you may be one of these days, but it's real a good part of the lives of these two persons, and one of the two persons will die at the end.
Yes, I didn't want it to...
So it's a complete life.
I thought when I started writing it that it would be much more like Dickens, and there'd be multi-characters, that there'd be all kinds of points of view, that there'd be 30, 40 named characters who speak and have a point of view, and actually I couldn't really pull that off. I found myself cutting characters and really focusing on these two characters, though there is a third character that I like very much. As in all romantic comedies, the central couple have inappropriate partners, the people who they're with but who they clearly shouldn't be with because they should be with each other. And Emma spends a long time with a character called Ian, I suppose, who is the nearest there is to a Dickensian character in the book.
Yes, he's very entertaining.
A very clear attitude, a very clear voice. He's a would-be stand-up comedian who is in no way funny, but who is relentlessly performing, relentlessly on, always talking in dialects and funny voices, and always punning and looking...
Always performing at home.
Always performing, yes. Because,
for Emma.
Because as he says, you know, if I'm not being funny, what am I being? He's very insecure.
Perhaps he's a male Mrs. Wilfer.
Well, maybe. I think he does have that larger-than-life quality. And when we made the film of One Day, the actor who played him, a brilliant actor called Rafe Spall, who's the son of Tim Spall, another great Dickensian actor, you know, brought to, I think, that character comedy quality to him.
And I think what's interesting too is that Emma, like Rebecca in your second book,
yes,
is a complete person. She's a woman, a real woman.
Yes, I again...
She's not a Dickensian woman.
No, I think I think if there is a model for that, it's sort of Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. Smart, funny, decent. I think I'm about to try and write the fourth book, and there are various things that I can no longer allow myself to write, and one of them is a smart, wisecracking, laconic, slightly insecure female character who saves the man, because I've done that 3 times in quite obvious ways. So I need to maybe write someone who's slightly more, maybe less appealing, less clearly the best person in the room.
In your first 2 books, the central character is a young man who tries to find out who he is and
yes,
what his life is about.
Yes.
And in the third book, the central character to me is Emma,
yes,
because I think from the start she knows what she's going to do, and even though she changes her profession,
yes,
from being ein Lehrer, what's that?
a teacher.
A teacher, yes.
A teacher.
She becomes a writer.
That's right, yes.
And Dexter really doesn't know what he's doing or why he's doing what he's doing.
Yes.
Apart from being a womanizer and a driven man who is deeply unhappy.
Though I think if I could do these mythical remakes of these books, I think that's one of the things I'd change. I always think when writers write books in which people become writers, there's something a little self-satisfied and self-indulgent about it, really. I mean, it makes sense in... David Copperfield, you know, finds his role in life by becoming a successful writer like Dickens, and it becomes...
Perhaps Emma is your David.
Well, certainly she's probably much closer to me than any other character I've written, though she's much better, she's much sharper and more principled and more quick-witted and more decent. But in her 20s, again, there's no point denying it. You know, there's a lot of my own experience in Emma's experience until the age of about 26.
May I ask you something about Dickens again?
Yes.
Since you wrote the scenario for the new film, I read in some paper I read that you had invented a completely new ending. Completely new ending?
No, I said that, and as the words were leaving my mouth, I instantly regretted it because it makes it sound as if there's some great sacrilege taking place on the story, and actually that's not the case at all. At the end of the novel, Pip follows Herbert to the east. It's never specifically named, but Herbert has a company in the east, and Pip follows him out there and becomes a clerk, but works his way up through the business. And one of the problems in adapting the book is that the book ends many, many times. That the ending of a Dickens novel, there are a series of endings. There's the ending where Miss Havisham dies. There's the ending where Magwitch dies. There's the ending where Joe saves Pip from penury. There's the ending where Pip returns home and finds that Joe has married Biddy. And then there's the ending where Pip meets Estella again. And when you put that on screen, it gives a kind of stuttering fill to the end of the film. And you actually start to think, God, just end, will you? Just end. And I hated the idea that the final scene between Pip and Estella should feel like another ending. So I had this idea, I can say this now because we're not doing it, but I had this idea that the final encounter between Pip and Estella would take place in the East, in Egypt. That she would, after the death of Bentley Drummle, that she would become a traveller, that she would travel the world, and that she would find herself in Egypt and realise that Pip was there, and that they would have a very tentative but quite tender encounter that was ambiguous, not romantic, not a kiss, not an "I've always loved you," but that it should take place in Egypt. And we loved this idea, and then we found that obviously that filming in Egypt was too problematic, and so we changed it to Morocco, and then as the shoot, and we were scouting in Morocco, and we had set designs drawn up, and we ran out of money. So I think now it'll take place in Richmond Park. Not even, but Richmond Park passing itself off as Liverpool. So it now takes place in Liverpool. Yes, in Liverpool, and it's. I wanted to talk a little bit about the ending because I don't want to sound defensive about this, but the standard response to the two endings, just in summary, Dickens wrote an initial ending which was a chance encounter between the older Pip, the much older Pip, and the much older Estella on Piccadilly, and Pip is with his nephew, young Pip, and Estella is in a carriage, and there's a very, very brief tentative moment, and then Estella drives away, and it's rather like the ending of Dr. Zhivago. It's kind of, maddening, and that's and tough and hard, and and Bulwer Lytton said that it was too tough, too hard, and he suggested that Dickens write the ending, which is now in the book, which is the standard ending, where they meet up again and talk a little bit about the past and about what they've been through, and the last line of the novel in manuscript form is, I saw no further shadow of our parting, save one. In other words, till death us do part. In other words, they're going to get married. And
changed that phrase many times.
Yes. Yes, and I think the printed one is, I saw no further shadow of our parting. I may be paraphrasing, but obviously what it's implying is they're going to marry, and people take that as a terrible betrayal of the book, the idea that all that stuff about Estella being damaged for life and being impenetrable is nonsense, and that actually Pip wins her over in the end, and that's seen as a sellout and a compromised ending. And I can understand that point of view in terms of them getting married. But the notion that when they're older and wiser, there's a tentative warmth between them doesn't seem to me to be a betrayal of the book. And we haven't shot the ending of the film yet because we're waiting for spring and some money. And, and so we will shoot it many times in many different ways, and we're all very keen for it to be true to the book in that it's tentative, but it will be a little closer to the Bulwer Lytton ending than Dickens' original ending. It won't have that kind of steeliness, I don't think, because I don't think that's a compromise. The book is always there, and I think we sometimes want different things from films than we do from books, and I know it won't be a big sloppy kiss, but it won't necessarily be as steely as Dickens' original intention. Who knows? I don't know how they're going to act it. It's a very sparse exchange of dialogue, and it will all be in the looks and the smiles. We'll see. So yes, there was a new ending. There was a radical new ending set in Morocco that is gone.
It won't take place with throwing shoes.
Well, in every other respect, it's a very faithful adaptation. I've done some things we've used flashback, which no one has ever used before, and which feels quite bold because flashback is such a modern cinematic device. But the biggest challenge in adapting Great Expectations are the three great chunks of exposition all novels, if you like, are an act of exposition. There's someone telling you a story, and within that story, characters sit down. Herbert tells you the story of Miss Havisham. Magwitch tells you his story, how he became rich. Jaggers tells you the story of where Stella comes from. They're long, long speeches, and every plot point in those 3 long speeches, that all the plot points are important. They all have to be there. But in cinema, there's just no way of having someone speak for that long and an audience staying engaged. So we've done something quite intricate of showing the past from different points of view, almost a kind of film noir sort of Chinatown approach, a gradual unveiling of the truth about Estella's origins, seen from different points of view with little clues revealed each time, which I'm told, I haven't seen the film yet, but I'm told in the edit suite works rather well. The first draft of the script started with, sorry, this is the last time I'll talk about the film, but the other spectre that hangs over anyone adapting Great Expectations is David Lean's film, and particularly the opening of David Lean's film, which is pretty iconic, Magwitch in the Churchyard. And we were all so scared of doing this that we tried quite hard to find a different opening for our film. And the initial script opened with, I still think it's a very good idea, Miss Havisham's wedding. That you see the young Miss Havisham, you see the note arrive, you see what happens, and the film is a gradual unravelling, a gradual revelation of Magwitch's involvement in that crime, how Miss Havisham attempted to recover by adopting Estella, but you see little clues that become clear as the film went on. And so for a long time the script started with Miss Havisham's wedding and then went to Pip in the graveyard, but it seemed too bold a disruption of the point of view. It seemed strange to a film that was entirely from Pip's point of view to break that in the very opening moments of a movie seemed incorrect, seemed wrong, seemed disjointed. So again, that was a bold idea that got cut. So so what we're left with is actually a pretty faithful distillation of a great long 500-page masterpiece, but one that takes relatively few liberties.
David, I hope you won't be angry if I ask you just one more question about your film script.
No, yes, please do.
In the BBC series, we learned today that Biddy had been left out completely. Was there anything really important you had to leave out and you felt sorry for?
Well, no, we certainly haven't cut Biddy. I mean, Biddy is the conscience of the book. I didn't watch the BBC adaptation because it felt too scary. What my relationship with the BBC adaptation is that I'm constantly getting congratulated for it. Which, I'm constantly I got a whole load of emails on the Monday saying, it's definitive, no one will ever do better, it's the version, it's a masterpiece, and I had to write back very politely saying, mine comes out in October. Thank you for your praise, but it's not me. But I do know from talking to people that we do keep Biddy, we do keep Pumblechook, we even keep Wemmick in The Aged P, which to us seemed important because it's the only good, healthy parental relationship in the book, and also because the book has to be fun. The film has to be funny as well as sad and thrilling and dramatic and dark. Yet we have an hour less than the BBC version. We only have 2 hours, 10 minutes. So I'm very curious. The one thing we do cut, which the Lean film cuts as well, is when you make a film, one of the practicalities you have to face is that you can't fade from one actor to the next. You have to have a cut-off point where the young actor becomes the old actor. And of course, that's not necessary in books. And in fact, in David Copperfield, there's a remarkable passage which is a kind of montage where David Copperfield grows from being a child to a man. And you can't do that with the physical presence of performers. So you have to have a break and then a new set of actors. And so we've cut out the death of Mrs. Joe. That happens off screen, and she dies of a heart attack rather than being hit on the head with the manacles, which in the novel, it's a beautifully plotted novel, but that's where, to me, the plotting gets a little... Dickens goes to great lengths to tell you, the reader, that the person who hit Mrs. Joe over the head with the manacles isn't Orlick. And then at the end of the book, he says, actually, it was Orlick.
It was Orlick. I think Orlick as a doppelganger of Pip is a bit overdone.
Yes, so we've trimmed that. So when you cut back to older Pip, Mrs. Joe has gone, and there's no Orlick. But apart from that, it's pretty close, or it is until they get it into the edit room. And then we'll see.
I liked very much what you said about the lots of endings this book has.
Yes, yes.
Because
yes.
it's a wonderfully true observation.
Yes. And that just doesn't work in cinema. You start to go, oh, yeah. Because you feel that you just
if you feel you would like to contribute something, please go ahead. Don't. We would like you to join us.
Very quick question. Did you do the voiceover for your Hours of the Marsh Country? Because Lean does it, and the BBC in the 80s did it as well.
Please use the microphone, because the people behind you won't be able to hear you.
Yes, the question was to do with voiceover. Ours was the Marsh Country, which Lean uses, and I think the Lean version also starts with the pages of a book being turned. And I think probably the fashion in literary adaptations is not to draw attention to the literary quality of them, and by using things like voiceover or pictures of books, and we've followed that. I think my experience with voiceover is it always gets cut. It always feels unnecessary, and one of the losses of as I said, the great loss of a film version is the loss of a narrative of the author's voice, and I think you just have to take a deep breath and accept that that's the case. So no, there's no voiceover. Occasionally you can find opportunities to put wonderful things that are in the prose into people's mouths, into the characters' mouths. But an example would be, it's a terrible thing to be ashamed of home, which I gave to Biddy as a line. And it felt too explicit, too wise, too knowing, too harsh. So it came out again, even though it's almost one of my favorite lines in the novel.
Which line was it?
I'm sorry?
Which line was it?
Oh, the line, it's a terrible thing to be ashamed of home.
David, you mentioned that you are about to write a fourth novel.
Yes.
And very tantalizing, you only said what you couldn't write about anymore.
Yes.
So, first of all, can you tell us a bit more about what you can write about? And secondly...
Well, if anyone has an idea for a novel this evening, I would really be grateful. That's the short answer. I don't have any. I had an idea, because I was reading so much Dickens, that I would try and write a David Copperfield, that, I was born on an autumn day in 1973, and take it up to the present day. Lots of characters, lots of, political observations of the time, and dealing with the miners' strike and the Falklands War, and friends growing up together, 50 characters, and I haven't got much further with that idea. I don't want to write a pastiche of David Copperfield, but I've come to a point, I'm 45 now, so the idea of writing another romantic comedy feels a bit sleazy. I feel like I need to leave behind the world of sort of first dates and student life. I feel as if I ought to be writing about fathers and sons and family. So I think family will be the focus rather than a love story. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You had a second point.
Second question is simply, now that you, like Dickens, are very much a successful and best-selling author, does that in any way change your way of thinking about a new novel?
Well, unlike Dickens, it's had the opposite effect on me in that I can't write it. I find it very hard to write. I find that I spend... it's much easier to talk about old books than it is to sit down and write new ones, and I become a bit self-conscious and a bit anxious and a bit... not paranoid, but a little. I find it very hard to find that freedom to think, and I tried taking long walks, like walking from Highbury to Richmond, and thinking, and it hasn't quite paid off yet. But I'm not getting.
The walks are quite Dickensian again.
Sorry, what?
The walks are quite Dickensian again.
Well, yes, no, absolutely. And when I was working on the script of Great Expectations, I find if I read a book, because I have two small children, if I sit and read a book, I fall asleep almost instantly. So I listened to it on audio tape. And went on these huge walks, the kind of walks that Dickens describes in his books. In Little Dorrit, they're always walking from Islington to Richmond, and I walked that many times backwards and forwards. And it's a terrific walk, much more urban now than it was in Dickens's day. But I haven't yet made it from Gad. Yes, I haven't yet made it all the way to Gad's Hill, but one day from Bloomsbury to Gad's Hill, I think is about 30 miles. But again, it's a lot less pleasant to walk now than it was in 1848.
Well, if there are no more questions or ideas or propositions, we'll say thank you very much for your attention. Oh.
David, you mentioned that shame is with you, and shame of family. Well, and it's a topic, a theme by Dickens. I wonder that I think shame is something cultured. It has to do with class.
Yes.
Would you see a way how Dickens here can serve as a model? When you talk about family and shame of families, I see this as an issue of being part of a specific member of a class.
Yes.
In whatever way, and I think in a way Dickens set a model here. Would this still be available for you and thinking along these lines? And
I would jump in really firmly and say I would never ever felt what Dickens expresses there. I've never ever felt any sense of shame about where I came from. I think just like a lot of bookish teenage boys who don't necessarily come from bookish backgrounds, I felt a little out of place, but I certainly never felt anything but gratitude and admiration for my parents, particularly my father, who's worked much harder than I've ever worked in my life, and so I suppose what I did take from the book was not shame, but a sense of restlessness and a desire to. A sense of aspiration without, exactly as he says, without knowing what I was aspiring to. And for me, that was education. I really, really wanted to study and learn. But I jumped quite firmly on that word shame. But certainly, that relationship between education and class was something I was acutely aware of in those days. Yes, yeah.
If I may say something too, the shame Pip is feeling for his background, I don't think that has to do with any shame Dickens felt for the Marshalsea time his father did, and for his having to work as a little slave. So although he felt ashamed for that, it has much more to do with the shame he felt for his secret life at the time he wrote the book. I think so.
I know now that we are delaying everybody by every additional question, but diplomats have to speak. Sorry, I'm Simon MacDonald, I'm the British ambassador. Thank you very much, David, for your talk, for taking me out of my usual milieu. One thing, I spot the difference between our milieu in your shoes.
Yes.
Diplomats all wear churches, and they're very uncomfortable. You wear the sort of shoes that I really wish I could, but I'm not brave enough.
Pair of shoes, yeah.
But one thing I don't envy you is that a diplomat would not wait 45 minutes before taking the first sip of his red wine. So, you know, there's some things you can keep. But as you were talking about Dickens and yourself, of course, I think of my professional life, and I think about the connections between the UK and Germany. And you talked a lot about aspirations. And I wonder if one thing about the UK, which may be in common with Germany, is we have this thing about, and Dickens had this thing about, aspirations in a framework, that there was a context that you aspired to, and there were rules that you wanted to apply to yourself. And in German, I think it would be anständig. You want to be decent. And so that something Dickensian is this sense of decency and not being corrupt. As I said, this is just a thought provoked by what you said this evening, so it could be completely awry. But I just ask you if this resonates at all.
I did notice when we were talking about the three books that that's a word that comes up a lot, decency. You know, that it's something that the male characters, particularly Pip, you know, learn in the course of the novels, and I think in all the three books, you know, there are these kind of boy men at the beginning who are selfish and self-absorbed and foolish and accident-prone, who become better people. And so I think that is probably, it's all, at the end of the day, as we were saying earlier, you know, it's all stolen from better books. It's all just lifted. You just sort of suck it up and produce your own version of it. But it's only struck me now that that is a kind of common theme, and the word decency does come up quite a lot. So again, the fourth book mustn't be about that. It has to be about something else, about someone learning to be indecent.
So thank you very, very much. And thank you, David. You did it wonderfully. It was great. I think you have to sign some books now.
Okay, yes, no, I'd be happy to.